It's not going to be too long before we find a Milosevic in the country. We find a proper demagogue who's going to say to people who feel increasingly alienated from mainstream politics, I'm not going to let them beat you anymore. And then we are in very, very serious trouble.
Well, the violence has been fueled by disinformation about the killing of 3 children in a stabbing attack in Southport on Merseyside. 17-year-old Axel Ruda Cubana, who's from a nearby village and was born in Cardiff, has appeared in court charged with murder and attempted murder. The Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has said those stoking disorder in towns and cities do not represent Britain and has given her full backing to police to take the strongest possible action. Well, let's talk about this with Ian Acheson, who's a former prison governor. He was Director of Community Safety at the Home Office and advised the government on extremism. Good evening to you, Ian.
Good evening, Carl. Nice to be with you.
Good to have you with us. I mean, what do you make of these protests, which we've already seen in Sunderland last night, in Liverpool, in Southport, of course, after those killings, and are now taking place across several towns and cities this afternoon?
Well, I think, first of all, it's incredibly important to separate the absolute criminality of the scenes that we've seen in Sunderland, and indeed some of the disorder we've seen this afternoon right across the United Kingdom, in places as diverse as Belfast, Stoke, Manchester, Liverpool, from growing sentiment from people who are angry about what they perceive to be the government's two-tiered approach to handling protest. The people who are involved in violent disorder, deserve to be in prison, frankly. This is naked criminality. There is nothing political about looting a vape shop, for goodness sake, or setting fire to Citizens Advice Bureau. It is naked thuggery, and it deserves a really decisive response from the criminal justice system. But the dangerous thing, I think, is to conflate this with a growing perception, which certainly has been mobilized across the far right, that police, first of all, are policing protests in a different way. That, as I said this morning in an article I wrote for The Spectator, that the intensity of policing of protests seems to be, in terms of how this has been propagandized, more intense when it comes to policing protests involving white people than people of other ethnicities.
So are you saying that you think that there is some justification to some of what we have seen, that perhaps the way the police are dealing with this is not the same as the way that they have dealt with other protests, environmental protests and so on in the past?
No, I'm absolutely not saying that. There is zero justification for the thuggery and violence that we've seen. What I'm saying is it's dangerous to conflate this with then lumping everybody who is angry or upset or concerned about a perception of policing, across the country. Because what you do then is you sort of weaponize this alienation that people are feeling, and you provide a context for further violence potentially to occur. The violence is absolutely the responsibility of those people who are carrying it out. If we see that there is some sort of organized conspiracy to foment this civil disorder, those people need to be punished very severely for it. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say the way the communications was handled in this whole debacle since the appalling massacre in Southport, and then through to the arrest and charge of the individual who's now going to go to court charged with those heinous crimes, and some of the other things that have then unfolded. I think the calm strategy, and that culminated in Keir Starmer's opportunity to speak to the nation and really say all violent extremism that is threatening to sectarianize our society now, from wherever it comes from, is wrong and will be met with the full force of the law. There was a very deliberate and I think very unfortunate focus on far-right thuggery, which seemed to some people who were involved in this wider protest movement that doesn't seem to have any specific kind of ringleaders to it, apart from a few people on social media who've got, to be fair, hundreds of thousands of followers, to lump them in with the imbeciles who are destroying their own communities and bringing shame to themselves and our country, frankly.
Well, just to be clear about this, Ian, then, when the Prime Minister appeared and he talked about this gang of thugs who went out, he was talking at that stage about the initial protests in Southport. Do you think that sort of language, when they talk about the thugs responsible for this, and Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying those people don't represent Britain, do you think that that perhaps our political leaders are not approaching this problem with the right approach? Do you think it's wrong to talk about them as thugs?
No, I haven't suggested that in the slightest. I think I've spent quite a long time saying these people are absolutely beyond the pale and need to be banged up, in my opinion, for a very long period of time. I am simply trying to, uh, you know, signal some concern about lumping hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who are concerned about the way policing of protests is happening in this country in with the violent idiots who caused such destruction last night is dangerous. And
So,
what
what do you think is causing then what we're seeing today, which appears to be quite widespread? We've got 30 different rallies being called in different towns and cities. We're seeing standoffs this afternoon between police and protesters in places like Leeds, like Stoke, like Hull, and elsewhere. Clearly, the terrible murder of these three children in Southport was the initial trigger. But what do you think is actually causing this wider problem?
Well, I don't think we've got time in this program to go through all the societal problems that we're facing now, where we've got a potentially a large section of the population who feel that politics doesn't speak to them or for them, mainstream politics, and they're being driven to the fringes because their views, which they see as legitimate, are being traduced as being far right, for example, or bigoted in some way. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to want to have a conversation about how migration has changed the characteristics of some of the places where these people live. You can have a decent conversation about that without actually falling into the trap of you know um, discriminatory or bigoted language. I think we have to find a better way in this country to be able to bring people together to talk about what their differences are, what holds them together. I've suggested to government, for example, that we need another arm of our counter-terrorism strategy, which is actually more about community cohesion, called Promote, where we find a way to bring people together to talk about what their rights are, as citizens of this country, and what their responsibilities are to give those rights effect. So we need to look at it in a much wider context here. There's economics that's involved. There's social disintegration that's involved. There is the atomization of the family that's involved. There are all sorts of things that are driving people, I think, to further and further to the extremes. And then you have events, that take place around the world, or you have signal events like the appalling atrocity in Southport that then gives legs to these grievances. And we've got to stop ostracizing everybody that feels concerned about what's happening in the country, and we've got to start having a conversation with them. Or I'll tell you this, just to finish off, to make the point. It's not going to be too long before we find a Milosevic in the country. We find a proper demagogue who's going to say to people who feel increasingly alienated from mainstream politics, I'm not going to let them beat you anymore. And then we are in very, very serious trouble.